Hi, everyone. This is Jim Jacks, and welcome to Jacks Confidential. Thank you all for your great response to our show last time with comedian, funny man, all around good guy, Keith Lyle. Keith, we were a hit last week.
Thank you, everybody. I'm glad you liked it, and hopefully we could live up to your expectations.
That's right, and we did even get, I told Florence I got a DM on Twitter stating Anthony S. Mafia, and he gave me his phone number, and it's in Chicago.
Nice.
So I'm scared to call it.
Well, call in, but don't do him any favors. Don't take any money from him.
Yes.
Thank him nicely.
I'm thinking of going to one of my enemies, making up, and then calling from there and chewing them out. So we'll see if that works out. But you guys really were cool, and I'm so glad. We're going to get into a lot of deep stuff today because we were just talking about how the Mafia it's much more complicated than people think, because it seems like whenever someone wants dirty work, everybody loves the Mafia, but then in the end they judge them pretty harshly. So the first thing that we were talking about, and I wanted to get into, is there was a show on the History Channel, and you and I touched base about it in regards to Bugsy Siegel's murder. And there are more and more people, even mob people, that are stating that Bugsy Siegel was actually killed in ambush by Virginia Hill's brother because Bugsy Siegel had a fight with her and hit her. Now, they stated, what I heard on the History Channel, what I saw on the History Channel is they stated, one of the experts for the FBI stated the one thing that did puzzle the FBI was it wasn't a typical mob hit. They felt if it was, it would be out somewhere and someone would just literally shoot him in the back of the head, or have someone that knew him did it, that it wasn't like a typical hit. But obviously we talked about, I believe Carbo was the one that everyone thinks did it. What are your points of view with that, Keith?
Well, I mean, no one knows, because the only people that know were the ones that are there. But
Sure.
Virginia Hill, it probably wasn't the first time he cracked her.
I bet.
So, yeah. And it probably wasn't the first time she'd been cracked. And that's not saying that it's the right thing to do. That's saying these are bad people doing things that may have been more common at the time.
Sure.
I don't think her brother would have the guts to go to a mobster and whack him.
Yeah.
Plus, if that were the case, wouldn't that brother have gotten whacked by the mob himself?
Yep, that's what I was thinking as well.
So that in and of itself, it's not a typical mob hit. No, because they probably didn't. If you put him, he probably wouldn't get in a car with mobsters at that point, knowing how much he owed. So there was no signs of break-in. So it was someone he knew that he let in, and they probably had a little conversation, and the conversation, as it went south, hey, you got the money? No. Okay, well, you know what we got to do? Boom, that's it. The element of surprise is most important, especially with mobsters. That's why they put him in a car and take him out somewhere where, you can't get a drop on him. And here, I just don't think if they say, hey, why don't you go for a ride with us? What do you think he's going to say?
Yeah.
I'll just stay right here in my house where, I'm okay.
I know, especially. And Florence did chew me out. She said there was not enough whacking, or the use of the term commission. So, Florence, that one was for you when Bugsy got whacked. But I think, in general, I think you're right. It seems to me a little bit far-fetched that the brother would do it, because especially at that time, he was pretty much, you'd have a death sentence if he did that.
Now, you wouldn't cross him out. I think on top of it all, I think mobsters would be upset. Hey, this guy whacked him. That was our whack. I mean, he did us a favor. We don't have to pay him, but we should be doing this. And I think those guys would be upset that they aren't getting credit for it. And today's mobsters are trying to, oh, well, we don't operate like that. It was this guy. It was that guy. Oh, we're, So at the time, back then they had enough lawmen paid off that they could get away with it. So it's great to have a conspiracy theory when it comes around these things,
Sure.
mob hits and whatnot. But I think it's pretty clear that he owed. I mean, we're talking about $6 million in 1947 or something. That's just you can't go too far with that.
Yeah, that's very true. And obviously Virginia Hill, I believe she was 48 or 49 when she met her demise in an overdose, I believe in Australia, if I'm not so some of
something
you
like that.
hardcore could look that up, but I think that was what happened to her. So obviously she didn't have a glory and a lot of glory in her life. So that was it all evens out. You sleep with dogs, you get fleas. So
Right.
a lot of stuff.
I also believe that this wasn't the first mobster that she was dating. She could have been dating someone else, and one of the other mobsters could have whacked them. Anything, there's a lot of button men out there, and any one of them would have wanted to collect on this because this was a high price tag, because this is a big made guy. And once the word is out, I mean, even if you're made, Meyer Lansky, someone gave the call, and that, that was that. Also, the brother could have killed him. Hey, it didn't cost us anything, but there's a bunch of button men that are like, hey, I got to make a living.
Yeah, so they lose out in the money for not doing the hit.
So then the brother definitely would have gotten whacked.
Yeah. Now, we had spoken before about the movie Casino, and your father-in-law, what a fascinating life, and some of the stories that you have. Why don't you talk about his brush with the Robert De Niro character? And he had one time where he was involved with him. Why don't you talk about that situation? Casino, one of the top mob movies of all time.
Absolutely, one of the top Vegas movies of all time.
Yeah.
So my father-in-law, I think he was casino manager at the Marina at the time. So it was some in the early mid 70s, maybe late 70s. He was invited to eat lunch with Frank Rosenthal over at the Stardust. There had been a situation where the Stardust had new count machine, like a new hard count machine. They go around the casino every morning, 4 or 5 in the morning, take the coin out, and they go count it. And they put it through machines to count. And Stardust had come to the Marina, taken their hard count for the night, and brought it over to the Stardust. And my father-in-law, who was a straight guy, his whole life, he said, oh, no, we aren't doing that. So he called over, had a little lunch meeting with Frank Rosenthal. Frank sat there very briefly, and my father-in-law said, hey, we can't do that. We gotta do it right here. And Rosenthal had gotten a page, got up and left, and never came back. That was the end of the story. That was the only brush he ever had with him. He had other brushes with people. My father-in-law, he ran a junket company, which brings gamblers in and out of town, kind of like the way that hosts do. And he had some brushes with like Bob Stupak, who owned Vegas World, and various other guys like that. And he said Bob Stupak was more shady than any mobster he ever met.
Oh, really? Wow. Yeah. The thing that I remember about Rosenthal was that the FBI I was reading some FBI files and things about it, and they said that he was secretly running 4 large casinos, and he never had a gaming license in Nevada. And when they found out about that, they got real crazy. And he then tried to get a license legally, and they denied him. So
they denied him. And the guy that you see Robert De Niro yelling at in the movie Casino is actually in real life Harry Reid, former Speaker of Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid.
Yep.
That's who he's yelling at. And what we found out, now you watch the movie Casino, all the mobsters, all the FBI chasing them, all these things, we find out years after Frank Rosenthal died, he was a mob informant.
Oh, wow.
He was an informant to the FBI for the mob. And when his car blew up in 1981 at the Tony Roma's on Sahara, which is still there, that's likely why someone on the inside of the FBI told someone else that this guy was a rat, and they tried to whack him.
Wow. Yeah, I also remember him. Boy, to me, I wouldn't mess with anybody in the mob, even if I was in the mob. But he was really good friends and best friends, I guess, boyhood friends with Anthony Spilotro, I think it
Spilatro, yeah.
was. Yeah,
Spilatro, yeah. They knew
Spilotro.
each other from childhood.
Yeah, and he actually ended up having an affair, I believe, with his wife.
That
So, or
is
his,
what they say.
yeah, so just a lot of crazy things going on at that. And the movies fascinates me by just the personality of Rosenthal. Was that pretty much how he was?
He was more, the way I understand it from people I've talked to that worked for him and knew him, he had a very big ego. So his ego was much larger than portrayed um, by De Niro. That's for
Okay.
sure. Now, the guy that Don Rickles was playing was in real life was a guy named Bobby Stella. Bobby Stella was a connected man. My father had known him a little bit, my father-in-law. But his son, Bobby Stella Jr., I had worked with at Union Plaza. He was a box man. And one day, gaming agents came in, put handcuffs on him, and took him out. He didn't have a sheriff's card. Every person who works in gaming has to register with the Metropolitan Police Department to make sure you're not a felon or have any. You could still work in a casino if you're a felon, but it depends on the felony. You can't be tied to organized crime, all these things. And because his dad was tied to organized crime, he couldn't work in gaming. So they took him out in handcuffs. And I was like, oh my God, I know the guy wasn't stealing. Because if you're on a table game and someone is like on a craps game and one of the other dealers or supervisors is stealing from the game, you're in trouble too, because you're either in on it or too stupid to see it.
Wow.
So
yeah.
I was afraid I was going to get in trouble. And it wasn't.
Boy.
That's what it was. He was a very nice guy, the son. But yeah, that's just that people. That's how people. If you, like I said, no one wanted heat.
Yeah.
No one wanted any attention on him. So like they'd tell my father-in-law, here's a guy, you got to give him a job somewhere. So they'd hide him somewhere. It was no problem. And it wasn't the only time. Only casino they would do that at. And they'd hide him and it'd be fine, let everything die down. And, he'd quit when it was time. And that was it.
Was the Nevada Gaming Commission as strict then as it is now?
I believe so. I believe it was because, especially at the time with Rosenthal and everything, there was a move to kind of legitimize it a little bit because the mob was actually starting to fail. We were moving more toward conservatism, toward the Reagan era, and that was definitely a crime and punishment type era. You see it in the drug sentencing guidelines. You see it so. Organized crime was something they definitely wanted out of there. On top of it all, if organized crime is, they're getting their street tax from legitimate business. Well, legitimate business, they want that money. Corporations, every penny they want. And you see it in Vegas now. I was actually talking with my in-laws about this last night. How the guy who ran the showroom at the Sands during the Rat Pack era, they had him in Life magazine. He owned houses, he owned nice cars and fancy property everywhere because he was the maitre d'. So you wanted a nice table, you took care of him. And of course, I'm sure no one paid income tax on these tips back then, but that was, how he made his living. And people made a really good living doing that. Everyone, maitre d's in every room, whether it was a small club, a big club, a lounge, everyone, they did all right. Everyone was allowed to make money. Now, it happened, I don't know if it's coincidence, but in 1988 when Mirage opened and Wynn came around, they kind of did away with maitre d's. They started doing ticketing. Everything was, you got tickets for your table in the showrooms at that point, whether it was Caesars or Mirage. So you got tickets. So there was no tipping the maitre d' because you had to sit at the table you were assigned.
Yeah,
so
if you watch,
no reason to tip the guy. So they took that tip money and put it into the price of the tickets.
You watch a lot of the old movies, like with James Cagney and stuff. I always see them when they go into a place, they slip someone money. They go, and then they go, we'll get your table right over here. And it was never like we have a reservation or it was just they'd give them, $20 or whatever at that time was a lot of money. They would give them a seat. So yeah, that was, and the thing, another little tidbit too was interesting is that the Las Vegas, I forget which paper it was, but the Las Vegas paper also stated that I guess when Rosenthal died, they said his wife was an FBI informant as well. So that's pretty weird.
I
So
would
the
believe
secret
that.
she must have known.
I believe that because they probably had stuff on her, but she wasn't the most honest person.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I mean, no criminals are honest, but the way that, you know, she wasn't an honest person when he met her.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, she was definitely manipulative and used everything she had to her advantage, much like Virginia Hill in a way.
Yeah.
The stories between Ben Siegel and Frank Rosenthal have a similar path, but Rosenthal is very similar because both wanted to be kind of famous, but not for being mobsters. Rosenthal had a TV show here in town that would air, I think, on Saturday nights where he had Sinatra on. He had, you know, big stars, but he spent a lot of time talking about himself.
Yeah.
And I've seen tape of him, and it's remarkable.
Yeah, Rosenthal, I guess, was interviewed and asked, how about Robert De Niro's portrayal? He goes, it's kind of like me, so I'll give him a 7.
Yeah. It's funny is everything ties in such a weird way. Their lawyer is a guy named Oscar Goodman, who eventually became our mayor.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a mob lawyer, and he would go on TV and says there's no such thing as organized crime in Las Vegas. And I was just thinking, seeing tapes of this, I was going like, that's what I want my lawyer to be, a guy who would just deny everything.
Yeah.
I mean, he was like Giuliani before Giuliani. It was amazing.
Oh yeah.
Of course, back then Giuliani was going after the mob.
Yeah.
He was like a big mob crusader, right? So he's the guy. He was going after the Teflon Don. He was going after everybody. He got him too. But now, you know, that's Oscar Goodman. He was mayor. Everyone loved him. His wife is the current mayor, who recently was on TV with Anderson Cooper during this lockdown, going, "No, open it up. We'll use our people as examples. Will you?"
Yeah. That's too funny.
Put vaccines in them. We don't care. Like, whoa.
You know what always cracked me up is in the movies, you always have the mob people usually have girlfriends on the side, and the wife is just this dutiful, sweet lady taking care of the kids. They've got to know what's going on with these guys, and you wonder what type of person would be in a situation. Maybe it's sexy, maybe it's fun, all the danger, but it just seems weird that a woman would want to be with someone like that, especially if something goes wrong. You don't know what's going to happen to you. So
I don't know the mentality
of
that. I don't know. You know, wives of mobsters usually don't get hurt or physically aren't physically in danger. But you get a lifestyle, I guess, and you know what the lifestyle is. I mean, I guess it's kind of like what Bill Cosby's wife was going through her long marriage. She knew that Bill was having women on the side. I don't think she knew that he was forcing himself on them and raping them. But you know that your husband is a philanderer. Same with Hillary Clinton. You know what your husband does, and you accept it. And however they deal, every relationship's different. When I was working at the tables in Vegas, I'd see guys with their wives one week, their girlfriends the next week, and I always had this thing where I'd be like, "Oh, Bob, I haven't seen you in a while. How you been?" And he'd let me know the last time he was there. Yeah, it's been a couple of weeks. Ha ha ha. Or, yeah, boy, it's been a year or two. Good to see you. He let me know.
It was kind of like when my very naive Minnesota relatives came to visit us, and we went out to breakfast. And you have a lot in the NFL. I'm not going to say the training camp, but the NFL training camp was there. And my very naive aunt goes, "God, it's really neat that these players have their nieces and daughters with them at training camp." And I'm going, "Yeah, Auntie is really good." So it wasn't it wasn't father and daughter day, but it's just so funny how these things happen. And I think Shaq's wife, don't quote me on it, but I'm almost positive it was Shaq's wife who was confronted when I guess Shaq was playing around a little bit, and she said, "As long as the check's clear."
Yeah, a little bit.
So I guess that's how they roll.
Well, that was the rumor with Lamar Odom's situation
Oh,
when he was
yeah.
with the Kardashians. She was over there blabbing to everyone about how they're all, because Lamar would go home and go, "Oh, you should have seen what Paul Gasol was with. He wasn't with his wife. He was with," and it was, she would go ratting everyone out, and they're like, "Yo," and then threw Lamar Odom off the team.
You got to stay away. Men have to stay away from the Kardashians. That's for sure.
Well, that's rule number one. Rule number two is keep your stuff on quiet. No
That's
heat.
right.
Learn from
Be
the
like,
mobsters.
that's why Florence always laughs. She says, "You're so secretive," and I said, "Yep, you got to be in today's world. It's just a little too crazy." Now let's get into people. Estes Kefauver is a politician, Democrat from Tennessee. He was in the Senate, and he was a really interesting figure, whether you like him or not. He was, like you had talked about in the last episode, the Dixiecrat situation. A lot of Democrats were really in reality hardcore conservatives, and he was kind of a different guy. He was one of the few Southerners that was for the New Deal. He was really into anti-corporation movement. He thought that the corporations were taking too much power. It was very interesting. He also ran for president twice. And I think they lost to Eisenhower and Nixon, and I forget who the other guy that he lost to. But he's an interesting figure because he went after the Mafia. Why don't you talk about what you know about him and his stance against the Mafia?
Well, he was a unique character because he was a Southern Democrat, and he was not as conservative as most of the other Southern Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
And he definitely was more of like a union guy. So he had this everyman, like the everyday person, everyday American kind of connected with him. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what gave him his, I guess, power, for lack of a better word, but that's what got him elected all the time. In 1950, he wanted to get, he decided to get the mob, the organized crime had become a thing. After World War II, everyone's looking for the next, there was, who's our enemy now?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there was the communists, and that came a little bit later with McCarthy, but it was the mobsters because here they were taking, if they had the rackets of the unions, here they were taking union money, right? They're taking money from everyday people, and it's organized crime. And that in the 40s and 50s, it had become a problem, and they had money from, back in the speakeasy days. So it's funny because as an everyman that Kefauver was, he also was known to gamble himself, and I'm sure it wasn't legal. So that's what made it kind of weird going after the mob when he was kind of, and back then, the election campaign finance laws were a little different. So mobsters were definitely putting into campaign funds. So I think in the beginning, there were some that worked with him. Other senators were like, "Oh, this is just his way of trying to get money from them for his campaign." But he really went after corruption, and that was the thing, because I think he also saw that as mobsters were giving to campaigns on and off the books, he honestly wanted to rid the country of corruption, and I have to respect that. So he started these things called the Kefauver hearings, where he went around the country. I think he had 15 of them, and had hearings locally. I think the first one was in New Orleans about organized crime. And they put him on TV. And in 1950, there wasn't much on TV. So to have this on TV, this is really the first reality show on television. And Americans were just enamored with it. They would go into like even movie reels, because that's how you got your news back then, was the movie reels before the films. People would just go to the see the movie reels of what was going on. They were just encompassed because it's got great things: mob, politicians, possible sex. It was huge. So they'd done a bunch of them, and by the time they were coming to Vegas, and everyone in Vegas was scared. Like they subpoenaed a bunch of guys, and Mo Dalitz, he left town. He was out of the country when the hearings happened. I think it was November 1950. And by the time they got to Vegas, like they'd already been conducting hearings for 5 months, so they were all kind of tired.
Yeah.
So there was only 6 people showed up. 6, they heard from like Mo Setaway, who was running the Flamingo. They,
Hmm.
let me see who else they had. Shoot, Wilbur Clark was there. They had the lieutenant governor there. So there were like 6 people but after like the first 2 hours, committee took a break, went to the dam, see what was going on over there. Because it is the Boulder Dam. It's kind of amazing, the Hoover Dam. So then they came back and did the hearings a little more, held a press conference, and that was it. It lasted one day, and what was interesting was everyone in Vegas was so scared because this is the federal government,
Yeah.
right? If they want to come and shut things down, they're going to do it. They have the
Oh, yeah.
power of everything and unlimited supply of money. So they were scared to death, and it was just like they came in, they like a tornado, and just left. That was it. But what happened was, since they came in and nothing, I mean, there was like, I think when it was all said and done, there was like 11,000 pages of in the final report. And yeah, there was organized crime. They were surprised that organized crime was tied into so many politicians and businesses and all these things, but nothing really into gambling, because everyone kind of covered it well. And there really wasn't, there was only like maybe 4 pages about Vegas out of the 11,000. And so everyone here in Vegas was like, oh man, we dodged a bullet. So it just made them think they could do whatever they wanted. So more mobsters came to town, and it made things a little, I guess from what they're saying, a little more expensive.
Yeah.
To keep everyone quiet.
Sure.
But it just emboldened the mobsters in town, and it did lead to some things like gaming control in '55 decided that the state gaming board decided that they wouldn't have any corporations, because they want to investigate and license owners, and with a corporation it's too many owners, so they didn't want that. So in '55 they're like, no, we don't want corporations. And they created the Gaming Control Board, which was more locally, and the laws were more stringent to limit the gangster applicants for licenses. And in 1960, they published the Black Book, which were the mobsters or people who weren't allowed in casinos for illegal activities. And that all came through the Kavaver hearings. It was all that's how it all started.
Wow.
Was, to that, but it did really nothing to damage the strength of the syndicate here in town. It actually kind of emboldened them a little bit. And it kind of pushed another wave of criminals to come in and do what they did. And just like anything, you push till you push too far. It was, I believe, 1969 when they started with the corporations with the rich guy that bought the Desert Inn. What the heck's his name? They just did a movie on him. God, I can't remember the most famous guy. Howard Hughes. Now, Howard Hughes was only here 4 years, and because Howard Hughes came and wanted to buy this, they decided, oh, maybe we could let corporations in. This will legitimize Las Vegas. And Hughes came in and he bought places and built a couple places, bought a bunch of land out west, which is now Summerlin on the west side of town. And he was only here 4 years, came and left.
Wow.
And because of him, there were corporations. Now, I used to work with the guy who was a shift boss there. And he was telling me that the guys, he had Mayhew, Robert Mayhew, who used to be an FBI agent, who was running his casino empire. And the guys that were working for Mayhew were Mormons, and they were skimming worse than the mobsters. So the mobsters had to go over to these guys and tell them to, slow it down a little bit, because you're making us look bad because they weren't paying the right people off. So they had to show them how to do it, so to speak. But he was only here 4 years. He was there and gone. That was it. And now, because of Howard Hughes, we have the corporations we have now.
Yeah, Howard Hughes did a lot of stuff in his life, some not so good. But I think what's interesting, and people, Kefauver was really a strange guy, because in some ways he was the first guy to ever investigate television for
Yeah,
juvenile
yeah.
delinquency for
Yes,
violence.
yes.
Yeah.
I neglect to mention he thought, the rise in juvenile delinquency in the 50s was due to the violence on TV, when we all know it was really rock and roll and Elvis.
Yeah, that's right. And he investigated it for 15 years.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an ongoing investigation. But then his conservative views, I'm in the medical field, respiratory care, and I remember his name because he was the first to take on the American Medical Association, saying that it was corrupt and that pharmaceutical companies were also corrupt because they were misadvertising along with the obviously the tobacco industry, that they were in bed with these guys also, that they were misleading people to take medications that they didn't really need or which wasn't good for them, and they wouldn't tell the people about the side effects of certain things. And he helped get more things involved, more entities that kind of put the mask on what all these things, because look at now, you look at the commercials of today. I always tell people on national TV, on the you look, and half the commercials are drug commercials, and then the other half are the other drug commercials to fight the side effects of the original drugs. So yeah, it's unbelievable. But he did play a role in that. So you have two real right-wing and then left-wing entities in this guy. And he also, I remember a news story about him. He was once called a commie and a pinko, and no one be offended, but he was called that by some other people in the party, in the Democratic Party. So, and they called him a pet coon or something like that. It has nothing to do with race, has to do with
a raccoon, because in Tennessee,
so he actually wore a coonskin hat, a raccoon hat, and said, "I'm not a pet." So this guy was really a character. Yeah.
He really was. And you know how he passed, right?
No.
Okay. So one day in 1963, he's arguing or testifying on the floor of the Senate. He's doing something on the floor of the Senate, and he has a heart attack right there on the Senate floor.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and he died 2 days later in 63.
Oh my God.
It was August of 63. Yeah.
You know what was really weird?
He died doing what he loved.
What he loved. I'd rather live doing something I don't like. But anyway, I never got that statement. But you know what's interesting too is after he died, they said he had an aortic aneurysm, and then he passed away. What's interesting is there were thousands of people at his funeral, but one of the senators called him the most hated senator in the United States. And that was really interesting, or the most hated politician in the United States. So real interesting.
He was I don't know who the most hated politician, well, besides the president, you love him or hate him, but maybe like Ted Cruz. A lot of people don't like him. He gets a lot of flack. I'm trying to think of another hated politician, Mitch McConnell or Chuck Schumer, but it was nothing like then. It was a whole different thing. Nothing like it is now. It's so divided now. It was nothing like that. Like this guy, he actually was a crusader for what he believed in. He really didn't follow party lines, and party lines were kind of mixed then. They weren't like they are now.
And what's interesting too is that he went on, because at that time, who was the lady that died the day before, that weekend before she was going to have a press conference? She's the only person to ever interview what's his name that killed Kennedy. Oh God, what was her name? She was on all these game shows.
Kelly? I don't know.
No, I can't remember. But she was a lot of these celebrities and a lot of politicians would go on game shows. And Kavafer, I didn't know this, went on What's My Line, and he was the first person ever to actually say the word mafia on television.
Wow.
So that's pretty amazing. That's pretty wild. So
I know when they had the quiz show scandal, he really was involved in that as well.
Oh, he was.
Wow. He definitely was upset about it. That was part of the TV thing. Like he was really unhappy. Yeah.
Dorothy Kilgallen.
Oh, Dorothy Kilgallen. There you go.
Yeah, she was the one that died at her home of quote natural colleges, or I don't know, whatever they did, and she was actually the only one to to interview Oswald, or no, Jack Ruby, I believe she was the only one to ever interview Jack Ruby. And she said she had documents on the case that would blow it wide open. And of course she accidentally died the weekend before her press conference. So that's another conspiracy theory.
It just adds to the conspiracies.
I know. I'm sad people die, but boy, it's good stuff to talk. It's fun to talk about. Tragic for the people, but crazy stuff in our government. Now let's talk.
And the roads lead come and go out of Vegas. It's amazing.
That's what I'm saying. Yep, out of Vegas. Now, I had 5 messages, and 2 were not nice. They said, "How in the heck?" And I'm making it PG rate. How in the heck can you say the casinos were better when the mob was running them than it is now? Why don't we talk about that? Because my father said the same thing.
Okay.
Let's talk about that. What was the big difference in the environment when you came to casinos in the 70s and even in the 50s and 60s, the Rat Pack days, all that stuff? What was the difference then? What was the actual, what were the goals of the casinos? Obviously to make money, but what was their goals for people that were visiting compared to what it is now?
I started in casinos in the early 90s, but I worked with a lot of people back then who worked in the casinos in the 60s and 70s and got clipped from the IRS in the late 80s and had to continue their careers longer than they should have because they weren't paying taxes because it was all cash. Mm-hmm. So if you were at Caesars in the 90s and saw a cocktail waitress that looked like she was in her 90s, it was because
yeah,
that's what it was. Back, Vegas used to be a value-driven destination. You could get 99-cent shrimp, probably 49-cent shrimp cocktails. You could play 10-cent craps downtown. Mm-hmm. There were places that were more luxurious. Yeah, $5, $10, $25 blackjack. Back then, that's a lot of money. You walked up to the table. The dealers generally knew your name. The rooms, you didn't have to gamble a whole lot. Generally comped. No resort fees, no parking fees, everything. And everyone was allowed to make money. Dealers were table for table or keep your own in a lot of places. So whatever you made that night in tips, you got to keep. Some places, maybe even the blackjack pit may have been, they get to keep their own tips within their pit. Everyone made a substantially larger amount of money. Let's say, for instance, at the Sands in 1972, they made, say, $74,000 a year. At the Venetian, in my best year, I made $72,000 a year, and I worked full time. So you'd be making the same amount of money, but it's 30 years later.
Yeah.
Cocktail waitresses, you give them $1 or $2, maybe a $5 chip every drink. It's the same $1 or $2 that they were making back then.
Yeah.
So
and the food
gone up.
Yeah, I was watching a show on what it is, I forget. It's not the History Channel, but it was Turner Classic Movies. And they had a really neat 15-minute thing on Vegas. But in the olden days, 60s and 70s. And my gosh, the food looked amazing. It was, the buffets weren't like it is now, but they're either super expensive and good, or they're not expensive and not very good. Right. But the food looked amazing. The drinks were it was like there was just a huge respect for the guest to get them to Vegas. And it just seemed like it was a totally different mentality than it is now.
Absolutely was. They just wanted you to walk through the door. Everything was a loss leader. You could go see Ike and Tina Turner in the lounge for 2 drinks. And there would be a comedian, maybe Shecky Green in between. And all it cost you was 2, $5 or $7 drinks, back then. That was it. You weren't, and people weren't cheap. They weren't sitting there and not getting, it was a 2-drink minimum, but they weren't just sitting and getting 2 drinks. They were enjoying themselves. It was about getting the gambler in the door. And, maybe because, that's where they were doing the skim and they had to send that money back east. That's how they were making their money. But everyone was allowed to make a living. Everyone. And when you look at it now, every resort fee, every parking fee, all of that takes away from tips. You know, we were talking earlier about the maitre d'. With no maitre d', with ticketing, advanced ticketing now, who's going to tip the maitre d'? There's no reason to. It's the same ticket anyway. So now he's got no money. So where does that money that you would tip the maitre d' go? You're still going to spend it. You spent it on the ticket because now the ticket costs more. So who gets the money? The corporation. And what does the corporation do? Do they make it better for the guests? Do they give you more amenities? No, they give it as a dividend to their shareholders, which is how American business works.
Yeah.
Yes, that's how capitalism works. Organized crime is capitalism, works that way too. It's crime. But if you are a craps dealer, a blackjack dealer, a cocktail waitress, a bellman, a valet, there are people, there's a whole generations of people that grew up in Las Vegas who, when they graduated high school, went right into valet and made $60,000, $70,000 a year for their life.
Yeah.
Now the valets are making half of that because of paid parking.
Yep.
So where does that money go? It's not going to the people. It's going to a corporation. And does it trickle down? I don't know. You tell me. Does a corporation make you do more for the same money, or do they pay you more when they give you more work?
Yep. And then
my experience has been, hey, you're a dealer, you have to do this. They took a box man off the table of a craps game. Now the box man's supposed to be watching the game. So now I got to watch my end, this end, the player, this, that, the other. You got one floorman watching 2 games. He can barely do that. The place is getting robbed blind because you don't want to pay this guy $150 a day. It's ridiculous because on paper, they're saving $150 a day. Meanwhile, at the Bellagio, 4 craps dealers stole over $1 million in a year that they know of.
Yeah.
So you tell me what's better. And no one stole if you stole from the mob, you were, you may not have gotten whacked, but you got your arm broken. On top of it all, every casino was owned by a different entity. So if, say, back then, there may be a boss that got a wild hair up his butt and wanted to show some power, so he'd fire you. He'd say, "You're fired," and you get fired, or maybe you get fired without cause. But you could go right across the street and get a job right over there, making the same money or better. You get a job down the street. There was always a job open, opposed to now where there's like 2 major companies in town, whether it's Caesars and Harrah's. And if you get stuck at one of them because for whatever reason, whether it's your fault or someone else's, you're not going to get work at half the casinos in town. And there's only a couple other places you could work outside of Caesars, whether it's Inn or Venetian, and it's not easy to get jobs there because you have to have a certain amount of experience. And they're good jobs, so they aren't always open. It was different then. That's why it was different.
Yeah, I think for the workers and for the customers as well, it just because the customers got great food, great drinks, they got good, cheap rooms, but they were nice rooms, maybe not luxurious, but they were nice rooms. And what ended up happening is they got a great experience. And then I go to Vegas a few years ago, and I'm paying $100 a ticket to see Carrot Top.
Yeah.
And my parents, no offense to Carrot Top, but that was the only show we could go to because everything else was booked because you can with the tickets. But also my parents, like you said, they remember going with they bought 2 drinks each, and they got to see Don Rickles and another famous person sing. And it's like, gosh, that is the price of admission right there. The Don Rickles icon, obviously he's not here anymore, but absolute icon for his day, friends with all the Rat Pack. Oh my gosh, that would make your holiday. And now I was looking at the price per person to go to Vegas, and I haven't been to Vegas in 3 years. It says here, if you plan on going on a vacation for 5 to 6 days, it'll be $1,200 to $1,800 per person to go to Vegas. And that's if you're going semi-cheap.
Yep. And the thing is, because now in a corporation, in capitalism, everything is a revenue stream. You have managers, you have bosses, all the way up the food chain whose bonus is tied to certain metrics. Whereas before, with the mob, up the food chain, the bosses, their metric was how much did you skim? That was their metric. And that's what you got. And as long as you kicked up, and believe it or not, there was no crime in town, very little. Very, very little. This is what they tell me back then. It was a small town too. There was, maybe 250,000 people at most. And everything kind of took care of itself. In a way, like we didn't have, there was no school budget problems, there was no road budget problems, there was none of these things. If someone needed this is a famous Mo Dalit story, they needed a park completed in 1975. They went to him and he said, "Do you want cash or a check?" He gave him the 25 grand, and he was man of the year. And that's how they got a park completed. But that's what they did. If you needed something, it got done. And, to be honest, having worked for Mr. Adelson as long as I did, and he really does put a lot of money out there. I may not agree with him politically. He puts a lot of money out there in charity work. But, for him, the Wynn Corporation, MGM Corporation, all these corporations, if the police budget falls short, a lot of times it's not because there's a problem in the bureaucracy. You guys could write that check, split it amongst yourselves, and have the police with force however you want.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? With enough cops to protect whatever. I mean, really something like that. And, the corporation mentality is, well, why should we put money into the schools? Because, they're just going to go somewhere else. They're going to go be educated. We need a certain mentality of our workforce. They can't be too smart. We need people to work for us.
I did an article on, I did an article, and I believe at that time, before the Raiders built the Oakland Raiders, now Las Vegas Raiders, built the stadium, they were 47th in education, Nevada, I think. I couldn't remember. And the same year, they signed the Raiders to Las Vegas. They agreed on the deal for $750 million in taxpayer money to go for a stadium. And that just kind of blew me away. The American way. What's more important, the kids or the Raiders? The Raiders.
Right.
So
that was what a lot of people said about the stadium. They're like, well, wait a minute. I know this makes us a legitimate city and all these things, but if we put this money into the schools, because face it, we don't have a state income tax, and the business tax structure is pretty good. So you could basically have Silicon Valley here. They would love to come here, but they're not going to take their kids from a great educational center in the San Jose area in Silicon Valley to here where the education is 47th in the country. Yeah. So many people were like, hey, put this in reforming the education system. We have, I think, the 5th largest school district in the country or something. Maybe we could do something. Yeah, it's one of the top 10. But maybe we could, split it down into quarters or do something to make it. And that's just not on the table. Raise the gaming tax we pay